Welcome. Come right in. You can't afford to miss this.
I'm already Sirius, and this is my show.
They're laughing at us. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. They're rapists.
Today I'll be talking to one of my favorite authors and a very good friend of mine, Erik Davis, about a new book he has out about the fourth Led Zeppelin album. That's the Led Zeppelin album with the picture of the old man hunched over carrying a basket of wheat on the cover. That's wheat, not weed, by the way. And it's a very mysterious cover for a very mysterious, nameless Led Zeppelin album. Yes, a whole book about one Led Zeppelin album. And we'll be talking to Erik Davis in just a few minutes.
Sirius.
So we're here in the studio with Erik Davis, a good friend and one of my favorite writers. And as I said earlier, he's written a marvelous book about a single album, the fourth Led Zeppelin album, a mysterious record with no particular title, although some people call it ZOSO. And Erik is going to give us a little reading from the book, and then we're going to talk.
All right, thanks, Ken. The whole sort of setup for the book is that it starts sort of with my obsession with Led Zeppelin when I was a teenager, which is, I think, when a lot of people become obsessed with Led Zeppelin. And I was just trying to reflect a little bit on what attracted to me at the time. Led Zeppelin knew something, but they weren't fessing. If only I could decode those four notorious signals. If only I could turn the idiotic wheel on the cover of Led Zeppelin 3 in just the right way. Then these mysterious figures would tell their tales, the Queen of Light, the Keepers of the Gloom, the Black Dog, the guy named Roy Harper. Then I'd know who was going to receive that nude girl child held aloft inside the gatefold of Houses of the Holy. The born-again surfers in my typing class knew. Satan. And while I wasn't ready to go that far, it wasn't clear to me, then or now, which side of the force made Zeppelin's majesty. Sure, Robert Plant seemed more like a randy, hippie pretty boy than a servant of the pit. But Jimmy Page, obsessed with the willfully scandalous occultist Aleister Crowley, was another story. Posters on my wall showed Page immersed in what Bowie called Crowley's uniform of imagery. The silk threads emblazoned with poppies and MAGA stars, the SS cap, the slit puffy eyelids that lent his face a stoned Orientalism, the Les Paul slung so low it seemed plugged into the Muladhara chakra where the Kundalini coils. This was not a wholesome man.
Thank you. So this is a pretty unusual thing for somebody to do a very intelligent reading of the sort of hermetic occult message behind Led Zeppelin. They're not generally taken enormously seriously as one of the more intellectual rock bands, perhaps because of Robert Plant's lyrics. You want to speak a little bit to that?
Sure. I mean, it's part of the fun of doing the book was because there's really very, very little written about Zeppelin that take them at all seriously outside of fan bios and fan sites online. And so part of the pleasure of the book was just to see how far I could take it, because one of my feelings is when you start invoking mystery, the sort of sense of the sublime or the sacred or some kind of mysterious occult energy, that it becomes an interactive thing where it's not just about what the band's doing, it's also about what you're imagining. That's a lot about what makes the occult appealing. So in a way, it was almost to see how I could take this record and how deeply I could go in trying to find out these meanings. But as is often the case with the occult, the deeper you go, connections start to happen and interesting things start to come together. So it actually came through really impressively in my experience, just how many odd little tidbits really started to fit together, because they do have a tremendous kind of emotional, dreamlike power, and just the fact that that's one of the first things you learn about the band when you're learning about them is that Jimmy Page was into Aleister Crowley, or even more that they had all like sold their souls to the devil. Like that's one of the myths you hear when you're in high school, and it's like, well, what's behind that? What does it mean to like have something that has that kind of charge, and how can you read it through this piece of music?
Can I just say something? I had no idea that this album didn't have a name. No idea at all. I mean, I remember seeing this cover. I remember the music. I had no idea. It didn't have a name.
It either doesn't have a name or it has many names.
I didn't know that.
It doesn't have an official name, but it's interesting how many names have been assigned to it by, for me, it's always been commonly referred to as Zeppelin 4.
Or ZOSO. Say something about the mystery of the name in connection to...
Sure. Well, I mean, in a way, the namelessness of the record is kind of what I'm talking about mystery. Like, how do you make this major, multi-million dollar selling record, like totally heart of the pop commodity world, that has no name? And what does that do? It's a very aggressive way of saying we have mystique, we have mystery. You can't know us all the way.
And to clarify, it doesn't have the name Led Zeppelin on the cover,
right,
which is different from the Beatles' White Album, where they
exactly. There's no name, and the label doesn't have a name, so it's this weird object, and it sort of reflects the way that they were able to, in the midst of like the heart of like huge culture industry, right in the mainstream of it, to do something that creates a sense of mystery, and kind of almost you have to go into it to figure out what's going on with it. What are these weird little squiggles on the side? Well, maybe that's a word, ZOSO. Maybe it's a word. According to Page, it's not even a word.
Well, how much of the mystery do you attribute also to the fact that it was pre-video and that music back then was dealing with the imagination a little bit more? You didn't always know exactly what they looked like, except certain very staged photos or album covers, basically.
It's a great question, but it's even more than just the absence of the images that sort of take down mystery, because there's not as much for you to imagine. It's that their music in particular, and this is where I think they were an extremely sophisticated band, I think, in the sense that their intellectual content lies in their production more than anything else. And Page is at least as good a producer as he is a guitarist. And that in particular, their songs, in particular the more ballad songs, are all about creating a sense of space where the imagination is kind of drawn up. Like you move through their records the way you move through a landscape. And Prince has talked about this. He wants to make a record where every song is like a new little world you go through. And that was something they did with the materials of production, and it partly calls up this sense of the imagination. So when you're a kid or you're smoking pot or whatever, it's like it's a whole world that's swallowing you up in a way that nobody was doing at that time, with the exception of a few psychedelic bands.
I always found Page's music to be very architectural. And I think maybe one of the clues to why people don't take the band as seriously intellectually is that the great genius of the band really is Jimmy Page and not the lyricist.
Very much so. And that's where the intelligence lies. And that's part of the whole mystique around Jimmy Page, is that he's this kind of hidden architect. And that sort of calls up this sense of like, well, what is he actually doing? What is he trying to do with this music? And so all of the lunchroom rumors about the selling his soul and all that is kind of it responds to a little bit of a sense of like, where is this power coming from? Where is the power of this music coming from? Who's designing it? Who's making it happen?
How much of the lyrics were written by, Plant versus
I think
Page?
they're pretty much all Plant.
The official line is that Plant basically writes all the lyrics.
Except for the first record, Jimmy Page wrote, I think, the lyrics to much of this, maybe all of them but one. But after, I think, by the time they got to Led Zeppelin 3.
And we'll be back in a couple of minutes.
Sirius.
Some people would stop doing certain things if they thought the monkeys were going to throw their shit at them. I'm already serious. This is my show. I'm already serious, and this is my show.
Part of the beauty of me.
We're back with Erik Davis talking about the mysterious Led Zeppelin quote unquote album. By the way, this book is published by Continuum. a series called 33 1/3, a bunch of books written about mostly classic rock albums. And a lot of the the occult mystery around Zepp comes through the relationship that's known between Jimmy Page and his fascination with Aleister Crowley, and him being a collector of Crowley and buying a house where Crowley did a bunch of his magical workings. And of course, Crowley called himself the Great Beast, and some people call him a Satanist, some people don't. Talk a little bit about how important Crowley is to the Led Zeppelin working.
Sure. In investigating, what makes this music work, what makes the mystery work, is there really a deeper kind of occult sort of exploration going on here? You got to look at what are the facts on the ground, what do we actually know about Page, because he's a very mysterious cat, doesn't review much in interviews. A few interviews he'll talk about going to seances or being interested in magic, and he'll mention Aleister Crowley on a few occasions, but he basically keeps his tarot cards close to his chest. But we do know that he was a big collector of Crowley's, probably the first or second most, sort of leading collector. Lived in his mansion near Loch Ness. But had opened a bookshop in the early 70s called the Equinox, which was the name of the sort of house organ of Aleister Crowley's Magical Society. So he was clearly very in tune with the very specific vibration of Crowley. And if you're sort of interested in what Crowley's on about using magic as a way to sort of create reality, create your experience, explore your experience, a tremendous emphasis on the will, a tremendous emphasis on kind of making things up as you go along, not staying stuck in existing metaphors or whatever. It's really hard to imagine that Jimmy Page didn't start doing things, but we don't know that. We don't know what he did. He might have just been a collector geek supreme. But to my mind, it suggests that there's some deeper stuff going on.
Yeah. This current runs through on a lot of rock and roll. I mean, there's a lot of reference to Aleister Crowley. We know that the Rolling Stones spent some time hanging out with Kenneth Anger, infamous Crowleyite.
Page also had some kind of relationship with Anger, I know, during the 70s, but I don't believe, I don't know how much you know about this. I remember reading about it in Cream when I was about 15 years old. They tried to get together on some project, and there was some kind of falling out.
Well, yeah, that's basically it. Page was making the soundtrack for Anger's sort of great work, Lucifer Rising, and he made about 20 minutes, of the soundtrack, and, basically, even though, Kenneth Anger had the most famous rock star in the 70s, like working for him free and letting him use his basement. He got sick of Page's sort of lackadaisical efforts and essentially, fired him and got really whatever. He got cranky about him. So those tapes do exist. It's kind of interesting music. The opening of In the Evening from In Through the Outdoor is sounds that are very much like what he was doing, more experimental kind of washes of sound, kind of dark, seething effects that Page was working on. And so that's another sign that he's clearly, sort of in the territory. And I think it makes it worth asking, what would it mean for this music itself to be enchanted on some level, even though we never really know what's going on.
Okay, I have a really lame but burning question, nonetheless. Did they not give this album a name purposely to create additional allure, if you will, or had they just run out of names by their fourth album? No,
there's a specific story they have, which is that when Led Zeppelin 3 came out, it was slagged by the critics. So most of the critics did not treat Led Zeppelin kindly, and they really did not treat their third record, which is one of their best, very kindly at all. And so almost as a kind of petulant act, they refused to put anything on it. But it was also, I believe, a way for them to express the power in the relationship with the record company. One of the things that marks Led Zeppelin, and in this they are sort of running in an oddly parallel way with the Grateful Dead, and that they were one of the first acts to really wrest control away from the record company. The Dead did it by just starting their own record company. Led Zeppelin still stayed with the relationship with Atlantic, but they really demanded a huge amount of control, not only over the product.
The album, no name.
Yeah, and that was a big fight. So it was also a way for them to just kind of do what they willed.
It helped the fact that they had like a 500-pound ex-pro wrestler as their manager. When you talk about wresting some of that control away, some of it was literally in a way that almost presaged Suge Knight was literally physically wrested away on behalf of the band by their giant violent manager. And that leads me to we were talking earlier about the vacuum of books that have been written about Zeppelin, and I wonder if you think that has something to do with the notoriety of Hammer of the Gods. And the book itself was fascinating reading. At the same time, has been, I mean, obviously the band is going to refute, mud shark stories and things like that, but its notoriety isn't necessarily tied to any assumption of accuracy. And right. I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Well, I mean, it's appropriate that probably the most scandalous and fun to read band bio from the time is about this particular band, because in a way they were the most scandalous. They seem to be the most heinous or exuberant with groupies, however you want to see it. And in addition to that, the groupies are one thing, but they were also extremely violent. They, as taking the organization as one which is not really fair. John Bonham was certainly capable of extreme violence, and so was Peter Grant, the manager, and some of the roadies they were associated with. So they had a legitimate reputation as being a sort of marauding band. So they were kind of playing out their myth, and at the same time, I believe, also kind of invoking a kind of dangerous energy that sort of goes into the music in an almost magical way, the same way that a music can invoke sexual energy and then kind of take it somewhere else, and that's part of what you're responding to. They invoked a kind of violence as well. Whole Lot of Love is a very violent song.
Speaking of books about Led Zeppelin, one of the reference points in your book is another apparently huge book written by a former Led Zeppelin fan who became a Christian. And there's some very amusing passages in there. You want to speak to that for a minute?
Well, yeah, that really was probably what made my book so fun to write. And in a way, he did some of my homework for me, because he became obsessed with this idea that they really were fully satanic, which I don't really know what it means. And even if Page was totally into Crowley, he wasn't a Satanist in the way that this fellow believes. But he just goes for it in over 650 self-published pages, diving into every little potential meaning of every lyric, going completely paranoiac, in all the connections that he makes. And yet, in some sense, he does some really interesting work, because he shows how deep some of the connections, some of the words, some of the lyrics, some of the music, can go, and that there is a kind of enchantment with it. It's just that he always thinks it boils down to this very, typical story of satanic control.
How do you think the backward masking scandal of the 80s on by the televangelists helped to sort of sustain their mystery during a period where they weren't doing anything creatively?
Yeah, it was amazing. I mean, if they couldn't have designed it better themselves, really. But it's no accident in a way. I mean, part of what I'm saying is that it's not just that they were able to make mystery and enchantment, but they were able to take mystery and enchantment and put it onto physical pieces of plastic that you would go buy. So there is a magic, but it's the magic of the actual object. And part of the appeal of this album is it has no name. The actual thing you're holding, you're like, what is this? It's sort of strange. It's odd. And at the same time, it's a totally mass-produced item. So the fact that the televangelists could then take these very same pieces of plastic and create even more peculiar mystery out of them is just totally, it's almost like if you were going to write a story about the most satanic band in the 70s, that's how it would have to end. And of course it did sustain, it did sustain them. It did give them a shot in the arm. And those samples are strange if you listen to them. They're uncanny, let's put it that way.
Well, I think that's a good way to end this session. The most satanic band of the century, Led Zeppelin. We will be back.
I'll get you for that, Ken.
Yeah, they're coming after me.
I always thought Toto was the most satanic band of the century.
My impression is the less satanic, the more satanic. But
Sirius.
So once again, thanks, and don't be afraid of the dark. I'm Artie Sirius, and this is my show. We're back with Erik Davis, author of a great, amazingly great book about Led Zeppelin's fourth album.
Sirius.
We're here with Erik Davis, author of a fabulous book about Led Zeppelin, about Led Zeppelin's fourth album, sometimes known as Led Zeppelin 4. And we had him on several weeks back, and we just couldn't get enough. So we have him back here again today, and he's going to give us a brief reading from this very magical book.
Right. Yeah, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the transition on the record between Rock and Roll, the second song, and Battle for Evermore, the third. Barely 2 seconds pass between the final beer bottle smash of Rock and Roll and the first chiming hints of the Battle of Evermore. For the listener, the effect is somewhat like stumbling out of Rockabilly Night at a biker bar and finding yourself in a sylvan glade with Frodo and Sam, hushed and reverent as a troop of high elves pass by on the way to the west. We have grown used to such juxtapositions in the sample-delic days of postmodern media, where mashups signify irony or geeky bravado, or just the way things work in an era of data glut. But the bridge Zeppelin builds across these 2 seconds suggests none of these. Here, the sharp contrast between genres, between rock and roll music and Brit folk, attests not only to Zeppelin's range of styles and moods, but to the amount of space that this record creates. Space enough for 2 tunes as different as milkshakes and mead to flow together rather than clash, to follow organically, to make sense.
When you were reading that, it struck me, we talked a little bit previously about the difference between Page and Plant. And Page, musically, in terms of musical themes, was very obsessed with the idea of dynamics. And that whole, I mean, the name itself, Led Zeppelin, is supposed to imply dynamics. And there's an inherent dynamic between Page and his darker obsessions and Plant with lyrics that were mostly dismissively described as hippy-dippy. And I mean, it's pretty clearly evident in that transition from rock and roll to Battle of Evermore. But I'd also like to talk about the folk influence of Zeppelin and how that's slightly kind of overlooked. And it's maybe nowhere in their catalog better displayed than in Battle of Evermore, Definitely. Which is a collaboration with Sandy Denny, who was in Fairport Convention, I believe.
Yeah. No, it's a really good point because, I mean, you know, the robot historians of the future will study Led Zeppelin for the power of their electric riffs, but the folk music dimension of them is as important and personally, ultimately, even more satisfying, I think, for me. And it's rarely talked about because they play this sort of cartoon role as like the big cock rock guitar gods, you know, and then we don't really, well, what about the soft side? What about all that? And a lot of their acoustic material, they both Page and Plant totally adored acoustic material. In fact, before Led Zeppelin formed, before he met Plant, Page really was thinking about maybe doing kind of a folk combo like the Pentangle. So he was very drawn to this side of the music. Most of their folk music has more or less has a relationship with American folk forms. But Battle of Evermore is the one where they tip their hat most strongly to Brit folk, to the idea that folk music can also be about the British tradition. So it's no accident that they have Sandy Denny on it, who was, who figured in one of the great, Brit folk combos, the Fairport Convention. There's kind of
like a Celtic vibe there that connects into magic and mythology as well.
Absolutely. Well, that's part of the thing, is the way that, you can go to a blues song and then sort of allude to some, Robert Johnson standing at the crossroads kind of thing, a kind of American myth. But also by going into British folk music, it's not just that you get to play with this beautiful acoustic sounds, but that it's a way of invoking a whole set of mythological associations, a kind of Celtic vibe, which they do in this song more than any almost.
It also brings to bear this kind of the very distinct nature that would emerge with Zeppelin, that maybe started with, like you talk about the irony of Led Zeppelin 3 being one of the lesser, I mean, and none of their albums were very well received. I mean, if you look back at the Cream,
By critics.
Yeah, by critics. If you look back at the Cream, it's hilarious to look back at those reviews because these are all records that are now considered untouchable in terms of their effect on music culture.
One song on the album, the one song perhaps that everybody listening has heard way too many times, I know I have, that sort of mixes the acoustic with the heavy, is the great song.
The great horrible
song,
Yeah.
Stairway to Heaven, one of like the rock classics.
Right.
I loved that song until they played it over and over again when it was out, actually, and have not been able to really listen to it since. But talk a little bit about that, because obviously it's has a big echo in popular culture.
Yeah, I mean, there's many things to say about that song. Actually, for all its cheesy horrors, it really sustains a lot of interest. Both the way the lyrics work, in the sense that they kind of seem to be implying some sort of mythological event, but it's not really clear what's actually happening. So they're sort of puzzling in the way that I'm suggesting they do very intentionally to create a sense of kind of enigma. And then what's happening with the music, the way that it proceeds very much from this very kind of almost medieval acoustic opening, and it slowly builds and builds and builds layers, and then finally you have these kinds of ruptures, and then you enter into a kind of electronic universe. In many ways, it's kind of like moving through time. I think one of the messages of the song is that whole medieval quote unquote world that they're sort of referring to, and that they draw from in the previous song, Battle for Evermore, as well. They're almost sort of saying you can bring that mystery and that magic into the modern world. That's a lot of what they're talking about. But the most, I think, interesting thing about the song, particularly about the lyrics, is that it's very much about song. It's about, there's a piper, there's a song we hear, there's the sounds, it's very much about the process itself of listening to music. So in a way, it's like a very, very sophisticated spell, in that they are doing and singing about what they're actually doing to you. That our stairway lies in the whispering wind. The wind is the air currents that are carrying the song that we're listening to at the same time. So it's almost like they really created a kind of spell in a song form, and the fact that it's repeated, and that our whole relationship to that song has to do with its inane repetition, is itself the sign of its sustaining power. But that's what you do with spells. You repeat them endlessly.
And I think too that the repetition and just the general success of Led Zeppelin means that even people who didn't study it on this level have it burned into their brain in some ways that they don't even know.
Absolutely.
Not aware of.
And that's ultimately the kind of magic I'm talking about. Is not about Aleister Crowley's spells or how the lyrics maybe were suggestive of something. The spell is the fact that the stuff is in our heads. We can't escape it. If they played a playback on our brains, we'd go through Stairway to Heaven with like crystal clarity.
Sirius.
I'm already Sirius, and this is my show.
Part of the beauty of me, part of the beauty of me is that I'm very rich. They're rapists. They're rapists. Rapists. Rapists.